The emergency room doors burst open at 3:47 in the morning with a newborn baby who couldn't breathe. His billionaire father could afford the best medical care in the world. 18 top doctors with prestigious credentials would try to save him over the next 2 days. But none of them could figure out what was killing him. Meanwhile, in a hallway outside the pediatric unit, a 12-year-old black girl sat quietly doing her homework, waiting for her grandmother's cleaning shift to end. She had been watching the baby, and she had noticed something that all those expensive doctors had somehow missed. What happened next would force everyone in that hospital to question everything they believed about intelligence, expertise, and who actually deserves to be heard. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The emergency room doors burst open at 3:47 in the morning. A newborn baby, wrapped in white blankets that looked too expensive to be hospital issue, was rushed through the pristine corridors of St. Augustine's private medical center. His tiny chest moved in shallow, desperate gasps. The sound of his breathing was wrong, wet and labored like something was go. Nurses in crisp uniforms moved with practiced urgency, their shoes squeaking against polished floors that smelled of antiseptic and money. This wasn't the chaotic emergency room where most sick babies arrived. This was the elite wing, the top floor, the place where privacy cost more than most people's yearly salaries. Medical equipment lined the walls, state-of-the-art monitors that could track every heartbeat, every breath, every fluctuation in a patient's condition. Machines hummed and beeped in a rhythm that should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. Baby Lucas Hogreave had been born just 4 days ago in this same hospital, delivered without complications in a suite that looked more like a luxury hotel room than a medical facility. His parents had left with him yesterday morning, confident and smiling, ready to begin their new life as a family of 3. But tonight, something had gone terribly wrong. His breathing had become ragged during a late-night feeding, his skin turning an alarming shade of blue that sent his mother into a panic, and his father reaching for his phone to demand the best medical care money could buy. Now Lucas lay in a specialized bassinet, surrounded by more technology than some small-town hospitals possessed in their entire building. His parents stood nearby, watching with expressions that mixed fear with the uncomfortable realization that wealth couldn't shield them from this kind of terror. Elliot Hogreave arrived 12 minutes after his son. Security guards straightened their postures. Nurses double-checked their stations. He was the kind of man whose donations had funded entire wings of this hospital. His name was engraved on plaques throughout the building. "Where is he?" Elliot's voice cut through the organized chaos. A senior nurse rushed to guide him through the secured doors. Claire Hogreave sat beside her son's bassinet, exhausted in a way that went beyond simple lack of sleep. This was helplessness, watching your newborn struggle for breath while waiting for experts to fix what you couldn't understand. "They're running tests," she said quietly when Elliot reached her side. Her voice was steady, but her eyes told a different story. "They said his oxygen levels keep dropping, but they don't know why yet." Within the hour, the hospital had assembled what Elliot called the best team available. 18 doctors would cycle through Lucas's care over the next 2 days. Pediatric specialists, respiratory experts, neonatologists with decades of experience and impressive credentials from the most prestigious medical schools in the country. They moved in and out of the room in shifts, each one examining the baby, reviewing charts, consulting with colleagues, ordering new tests. The diagnosis seemed straightforward on paper: respiratory distress in a newborn. It happens sometimes, even in babies who had been perfectly healthy at birth. The treatments were standard protocol: oxygen support, careful monitoring, medications to help the lungs function more efficiently. But Lucas wasn't responding the way he should. Every intervention seemed to work temporarily, giving everyone a moment of hope before his condition declined again. Dr. Nolan Price, the senior pediatric specialist, stood at the nurse's station reviewing test results. He was a man who had built his reputation on being right. His confidence was earned, backed by years of successful treatments. "The lungs are clear," he said, tapping the tablet. "No infection, no fluid buildup, no structural abnormalities. Everything points to simple respiratory distress, but he's not improving. Dr. Sophia Lang stood beside him. She was younger, less certain, more willing to question. What about reflux? Some nurses mentioned he struggles more during and after feedings. Dr. Price barely glanced up. All newborns have some degree of reflux. It's normal. We're treating the respiratory issue, not chasing coincidences. But Claire had noticed the pattern even if the doctors dismissed it. She watched her son around the clock, memorizing every detail of his behavior because mothers did that. They saw things that machines and credentials couldn't measure. Lucas did seem to worsen after feedings. His breathing became more labored, his tiny face scrunching up in discomfort, his oxygen levels dipping lower on the monitors. She mentioned it to nurses, to doctors during their rounds, to anyone who would listen. It's probably just coincidence, one doctor told her gently. Babies this young don't have predictable patterns yet. We're monitoring everything, I promise. But it didn't feel like coincidence to Claire. It felt like something everyone was too busy to see. Imani Carter sat in the hallway outside the unit, her back straight against the wall, a worn notebook balanced on her knees. She was 12 years old, small for her age, with her hair pulled back in neat braids. Her school backpack rested beside her, homework half finished. This was routine for Imani. While other kids went home after school, she came to the hospital, finding quiet corners where she could work without bothering anyone. She'd learned to be invisible, to sit so still that adults forgot she was there. It was a skill developed over years of being too quiet for the loud students, too observant for teachers who preferred kids who didn't ask complicated questions. But being invisible meant she saw things. Tonight, she'd been watching the urgent activity around baby Lucas's room, and she noticed something that made her pause mid-homework. Every time a nurse carried Lucas out for a procedure, the baby seemed to breathe differently depending on how he was held. When they laid him flat, his breathing became rapid and shallow. But when nurses held him upright, his breathing seemed to ease slightly. The difference was subtle. Imani had grown up watching her grandmother work in this hospital. Ruth Carter had spent 40 years in healthcare, first as a midwife's assistant in rural communities where doctors were scarce. Later, she'd worked as a sanitation supervisor at St. Augustine's. She said hospitals taught you things if you paid attention. Ruth had taught Imani to notice things, to understand that bodies communicated in ways beyond words, that babies especially told you what hurt if you knew how to watch them. Pay attention to the small changes, Ruth would say. Doctors know medicine, but sometimes they forget to just watch. Now, sitting in the hallway, Imani watched Lucas through the observation window. She saw him lying flat, saw the way his breathing seemed to struggle, saw his parents hovering with helpless fear. And she remembered something her grandmother had told her about babies who couldn't breathe properly when lying down. Ruth's cleaning cart rolled down the hallway. She was in her 70s now, her hair gray beneath her surgical cap. When she reached Imani, she paused, resting one hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "You've been sitting here long?" Ruth asked quietly. "Since 4, Imani replied. "I finished most of my homework." Ruth glanced toward Lucas's room, her expression thoughtful. She'd heard the nurses talking about the baby, about the wealthy family and the specialists who couldn't solve such a simple case. "That poor baby," Ruth murmured. Then, softer, "Babies tell you what hurts if you know how to watch." Imani looked up at her grandmother. She'd heard that statement before, usually when Ruth talked about delivering babies where medical equipment was limited. Inside Lucas's room, another feeding was about to begin. A nurse carefully lifted him, supporting his tiny head while Claire positioned herself in a chair. The process was gentle, practiced. Elliot stood near the doorway, watching intensely. When a nurse's hands trembled slightly, Elliot's voice cut through the quiet. "Careful. You almost dropped him." The nurse flinched, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry, sir. I have him securely. Just be more careful," Elliot snapped, his frustration finding an easy target. "We're paying for the best care, not incompetence." Imani felt her hands tighten around her notebook. She'd seen this before, people with power using it when they were scared. Her grandmother had taught her that fear came out as anger sometimes. The feeding began. Claire held Lucas, murmuring soft words. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. But then his breathing changed. It started with small coughs, then gasps that sounded wet and desperate. His skin began losing color, shifting toward bluish. The oxygen monitor began beeping urgently. Claire's eyes went wide as nurses rushed in, taking Lucas, laying him flat while they adjusted his oxygen. It happened again, Claire whispered, her voice breaking. Just like before. Just like every other feeding. Dr. Lang appeared in the doorway, summoned by the alert. She moved quickly, checking his stats, observing his labored breathing. Within minutes, his oxygen levels began climbing back toward normal, his color slowly returning. But the pattern was undeniable. Every feeding ended the same way. Choking, oxygen dropping, panic, stabilization. From the hallway, Imani had watched the entire episode. She'd seen the moment Lucas's breathing changed, seen the panic that followed. But more than that, she'd noticed something the adults seemed to miss in their urgency. Lucas had been fine until they laid him flat. The choking had started within seconds of him being positioned on his back. And when the nurses had lifted him slightly to adjust his mask, his breathing had improved almost immediately, before the oxygen had even reached full flow. Imani pulled her notebook on her lap, flipping to a blank page. Her handwriting was careful and precise as she wrote, "He can't breathe lying down." She stared at the words for a long moment. It seemed so obvious now that she'd written down. But she was 12 years old, sitting in a hallway, while 18 of the best doctors were inside that room with machines and tests and years of medical school. Who was she to think she'd noticed something they'd missed? Ruth returned from emptying her cart, settling against the wall beside Imani. "Long day?" Imani asked. "Every day's long when you're my age," Ruth replied with a small smile. Then she noticed the open notebook in Imani's lap, saw the single line of writing. She read it silently, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more complex, recognition mixed with concern. "You've been watching that baby," Ruth said quietly. It wasn't a question. Imani nodded, not quite meeting her grandmother's eyes. "Something's wrong with how they're treating him. I think it's not his lungs. I think it's the position." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and gently closed Imani's notebook. "You might be right," she said carefully. "But baby, knowing something and getting people to listen are two different things." "But if I'm right, if you're right," Ruth interrupted gently, "that baby still might not make it. Because the people who need to hear you aren't ready to listen yet." The morning brought no improvement. Lucas's condition continued its frustrating pattern. Temporary stability followed by sharp decline. The medical team rotated shifts, fresh doctors reviewing the same charts, looking for some detail that had been overlooked. Dr. Price stood at the central monitoring station, surrounded by screens showing Lucas's vital signs. He'd barely slept. In his 28 years as a pediatric specialist, he'd handled far more complex cases. This should have been straightforward. "We're missing something," Dr. Lang said, appearing beside him. She looked exhausted. "The pattern is too consistent to be random respiratory distress." "All the tests," Dr. Price began, "show normal lung function, I know," Dr. Lang finished. "But what if we're testing the wrong thing?" Dr. Price's jaw tightened. This was the problem with younger doctors. They questioned everything instead of trusting established protocols. "We're following standard treatment for his symptoms. If you have a specific alternative diagnosis based on evidence, present it. Otherwise, speculation doesn't help." Dr. Lang wanted to argue, but recognized the dismissal in his tone. In the hospital hierarchy, questioning senior physicians was risky, especially when they were men like Dr. Price whose reputations could make or break younger doctors' careers. She swallowed her frustration and returned to checking on her other patients, but the doubt remained, growing stronger with each unsuccessful treatment cycle. Claire had noticed Imani. It was impossible not to, really, this quiet child who sat in the hallway day after day, watching everything with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed too serious for someone so young. At first, Claire had assumed Imani was waiting for a sick family member, perhaps a parent or sibling being treated somewhere in the hospital. But the child never entered any of the rooms, never visited anyone. She just sat against the wall, doing homework, watching. On the second day of Lucas's hospitalization, Claire finally asked a nurse about her. "Oh, that's Imani," the nurse explained. "Her grandmother works sanitation here. The kid does her homework while waiting for Ruth's shift to end. She's here most evenings. Quiet as a mouse, never causes any trouble." Claire found herself drawn to the girl's calm presence. In a place full of urgent voices and frightening medical equipment, there was something settling about seeing a child sitting peacefully with a book, as if normal life could continue even in the middle of crisis. But what truly caught Claire's attention was the way Imani watched the medical staff. Not with a child's typical curiosity about adults doing important work, but with a focus that suggested she was processing what she observed, drawing conclusions, seeing patterns. Claire recognized that look. She'd worn it herself in business meetings where she was the only woman in the room, learning to read situations through careful observation, because asking direct questions was often dismissed as feminine uncertainty. During one of Lucas's better moments, a brief window when his breathing was relatively stable and Claire had been encouraged to step away for a quick meal, she approached Imani in the hallway. "You're here a lot," Claire said gently, settling into the chair beside the girl. "Do you like reading?" Imani looked up from her history textbook, surprise flickering across her features. Adults didn't usually talk to her. "Yes, ma'am," she replied quietly. "What are you studying?" "American Revolution. We have a test Friday." Imani closed the book carefully, placing a worn paper bookmark between the pages. "Your baby's doing a little better right now." The statement was delivered matter-of-factly, without the rehearsed sympathy adults often offered. Claire appreciated the directness. "You've been paying attention to him." "I noticed things," Imani said simply. Then, hesitantly, "He seems to breathe better when people hold him." Claire felt something tighten in her chest. This child had noticed what she'd been trying to tell doctors for 2 days. "He does, doesn't he? But they say it's coincidence." Imani didn't respond, but her expression suggested she didn't believe in coincidences either. That afternoon brought another crisis. Lucas's breathing became so labored that Dr. Price ordered increased oxygen support and discussed the possibility of intubation, inserting a breathing tube down the baby's throat to mechanically support his respiratory function. Claire felt her world narrowing to the sound of medical terminology she barely understood and the sight of her newborn son fighting for every breath. Elliot stood beside her, his phone in hand, but forgotten for once. Wealth couldn't fix this. Connections couldn't fix this. All his power meant nothing when his 4-day-old son couldn't breathe properly, and nobody could explain why. The medical team stabilized Lucas again, but it was becoming clear that stabilization wasn't solving the problem. It was just buying time until the next crisis. Dr. Price stepped into the hallway to update the parents, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes showing strain. "We're doing everything we can," he assured them. "Sometimes newborns just need time to develop stronger respiratory systems. We're supporting him while his body adjusts." "But you don't know what's wrong," Claire said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of painful fact. Dr. Price hesitated, then nodded. "We're still determining the root cause. But I promise you, he's getting the best care available." After he left, Claire stood in the hallway feeling more helpless than she'd ever felt in her life. She'd faced difficult business negotiations, navigated complicated social situations, handled crises that would have broken other people. But none of that had prepared her for watching her baby struggle, while experts admitted they were guessing. Imani had witnessed the entire exchange from her usual spot. She'd also heard fragments of the medical team's private conversations, the discussions they had in lowered voices at the nurse's station about treatment options running thin and diagnostic uncertainty. Adults always assumed children weren't listening, or that they wouldn't understand if they were. But Imani understood enough. She remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago, back when Ruth still talked freely about her decades working with midwives in rural communities. There had been babies who couldn't breathe properly when lying flat, Ruth had explained. Their airways were shaped in a way that gravity worked against them. The medical term was something complicated that Imani couldn't quite recall, but the solution had been simple: keep them upright, especially after feeding when reflux could make the breathing problem worse. But that knowledge came from old country practices, from women who weren't doctors, from medicine that happened in homes instead of hospitals with expensive equipment. Who would believe a 12-year-old girl who heard about it from her grandmother, who mopped floors? That evening, as another feeding time approached, Imani found herself gripping her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles ached. She knew what was going to happen. Lucas would nurse or take a bottle. He'd be laid flat in his bassinet, and within minutes his breathing would collapse again. The cycle would repeat, and each time it happened, he seemed to recover a little slower. She watched through the observation window as a nurse prepared Lucas for feeding. Claire held her son carefully, whispering soft reassurances. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal, a mother and newborn in a peaceful moment of connection. Then the feeding ended. The nurse gently took Lucas, laid him flat in his bassinet to burp him, and within seconds his tiny face began to change color. The choking sound started, wet and desperate. Oxygen levels on the monitor began dropping. 92%, 88, 85. Imani turned away from the window, her heart pounding. She couldn't watch it again. She couldn't sit here, knowing something and doing nothing. Ruth found her granddaughter in the small break room at the end of the hallway, sitting with her head in her hands. Ruth set down her cleaning supplies and joined Imani at the small table, waiting quietly until the girl was ready to speak. "Why does he breathe better when they hold him up?" Imani finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruth studied her granddaughter's face, seeing the struggle there, the burden of knowing something important and feeling powerless to act on it. She'd carried that same burden herself over the years, watching doctors make mistakes she recognized but couldn't correct because who was she? Just a cleaning woman with old-fashioned ideas from her time, helping deliver babies in homes that couldn't afford hospitals. "You remember what I told you about babies with soft airways?" Ruth asked gently. Imani nodded. "You said some babies are born with airways that collapse when they lie flat. The weight of their head, or something about gravity, makes it hard for air to get through." "Laryngomalacia," Ruth said quietly. "That's what the doctors called it back when I was assisting births. Most common cause of noisy breathing in infants, but it usually got better on its own as the baby grew. The trick was keeping them upright, especially after feeding." "Why aren't the doctors checking for that?" Ruth sighed. "Because it's not the kind of thing that shows up on their fancy machines. You diagnose it by watching the baby, by noticing when the breathing gets worse and when it gets better. And in a place like this," she gestured toward the expensive equipment visible through the doorway, "they trust their tests more than their eyes." "But you could tell them," Imani pressed. "You know what it is. Baby, I'm a sanitation worker. They're not going to listen to me any more than they'd listen to you." Ruth reached across the table, taking Imani's hands in her own. "Sometimes knowing the truth isn't enough. Sometimes you have to wait until people are ready to hear it. And if they're not ready in time..." Ruth didn't answer because they both knew what that meant. That night, after Ruth's shift ended and they'd taken the bus home to their small apartment across the city, Ruth sat at her kitchen table with her old phone, scrolling through contacts she hadn't called in years. She found a number she was looking for, a former colleague who'd worked with her decades ago in rural healthcare, someone who might still have access to case records that documented what they'd seen. She typed out a text message, her aged fingers moving slowly across the screen. "Need records. Old cases. Tonight." The response came 40 minutes later. "What are you looking for?" Ruth typed carefully. "Newborn with breathing problems went flat. Rich family at St. Augustine's. 18 doctors can't figure it out." The reply was immediate. "Same old story. I'll see what I can find." Ruth set her phone down and looked across the small living room to where Imani sat doing homework at their second-hand dining table. The girl was trying to focus on her assignments, but her eyes kept losing their place on the page, her mind clearly elsewhere. "Grandma," Imani said without looking up, "what if you're right and that baby dies because nobody listened?" "Then it wouldn't be the first time," Ruth replied quietly. "And it won't be the last. That's the truth about medicine, baby. It's not just about knowing what's wrong. It's about who gets to decide what counts as knowing." Back at the hospital, Dr. Lang sat alone in the doctor's lounge reviewing Lucas's chart for the dozenth time. Something about this case bothered her beyond the obvious tragedy of a sick newborn. The pattern was too clear, too consistent to be random respiratory distress. She'd mentioned her doubts to Dr. Price earlier and been essentially dismissed. The unspoken message was clear: don't embarrass the department by questioning the senior specialist's judgment. But her instincts kept screaming that they were missing something fundamental. She pulled up Lucas's feeding schedule on her tablet, cross-referencing it with his episodes of respiratory distress. Every single crisis had occurred within 20 minutes of a feeding, and specifically after he'd been laid flat. When he was being held upright for procedures or examinations, his breathing was imperfect but manageable. She thought about bringing this observation back to Dr. Price, but knew how that conversation would go. He'd point to the clear lung x-rays, the normal blood work, the absence of any structural abnormalities that would explain position-dependent breathing problems. He'd remind her that correlation wasn't causation and that medical decisions needed to be based on evidence, not hunches. Sophia Lang had worked hard to get where she was in her medical career. She'd endured the skepticism and subtle discrimination that came with being a woman in emergency medicine. She'd learned when to push back and when to stay silent, when her instincts were worth fighting for and when she needed to trust more experienced colleagues. But this time felt different. This time, staying silent felt like complicity. She picked up her phone and did something she rarely did. She called a friend outside St. Augustine's, a neonatologist at a university hospital across town. They'd gone to medical school together, maintained their friendship through residency and into their respective specialties. "Tell me about position-dependent breathing problems in newborns," Dr. Lang said when her friend answered. "That's specific," her friend replied, sounding amused. "What's the case?" Dr. Lang explained Lucas's symptoms, the pattern of distress, the lack of clear diagnosis despite extensive testing. Her friend listened without interrupting, and when Dr. Lang finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Have they tested for laryngomalacia?" her friend finally asked. "I don't think so." "What is it?" "Soft, immature structures in the larynx that can collapse during breathing, especially when the baby is supine. Gravity works against them. It's actually the most common cause of stridor in infants, but it's often missed in places with great technology because you can't see it on standard X-rays or scans. You diagnose it by observation and sometimes with direct laryngoscopy." Dr. Lang felt her pulse quicken. "How do you treat it?" "Mostly conservative management. Keep them upright as much as possible, especially during and after feeds. Most babies outgrow it by 18 months as their airways develop. Severe cases might need surgery, but that's rare." After hanging up, Dr. Lang sat staring at her phone. She had a potential diagnosis that fit all of Lucas's symptoms, but it came from a source that wasn't on his primary care team. If she brought this to Dr. Price, he'd want to know why she'd been consulting outside doctors. It would look like she didn't trust his judgment, like she was undermining his authority. But a 4-day-old baby was struggling to breathe, and the current treatment plan wasn't working. How many more feeding cycles could Lucas endure before his tiny body gave out? She made her decision. She'd present the information to Dr. Price in the morning, frame it as something she'd come across in recent medical literature rather than from a phone call to a friend. She'd be diplomatic, suggest it as one possibility worth investigating. If he dismissed her again, at least she'd tried. What Dr. Lang didn't know was that she wasn't the only one who'd figured it out. Down in the hospital's basement level, Ruth Carter was reading through old case files that her former colleague had managed to scan and email, documentation of dozens of births where babies had presented with similar symptoms and been successfully treated with simple positioning changes. And in a small apartment across the city, a 12-year-old girl lay in bed, unable to sleep, her notebook open beside her pillow to a page where she'd written the same phrase over and over: "He can't breathe lying down." Tomorrow, one way or another, the truth would have to surface. The question was whether it would come soon enough, and from whom the doctors would be willing to hear it. The previous night had ended with Ruth reaching out for old medical records and Dr. Lang quietly consulting a colleague about position-dependent breathing problems. Now, as dawn broke over St. Augustine's private medical center, The situation had grown more desperate. Lucas's breathing episodes were becoming more frequent, his recovery times longer. The tiny baby was growing weaker with each crisis. At 6:30 in the morning, the monitors erupted in alarming sounds. Code blue. Medical staff flooded into the room as Lucas's oxygen levels plummeted to dangerous territory. His lips had turned dusky blue, his tiny body limp. Claire stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, while Elliot gripped the doorframe. Dr. Price led the emergency response. Nurses adjusted oxygen flow, checked lines, administered emergency medications. For 3 terrifying minutes, Lucas teetered on the edge. Then, slowly, his vital signs began to stabilize. Color returned to his face. His chest rose and fell with labored but consistent breaths. But everyone in that room understood what they'd just witnessed. Lucas had nearly died. Dr. Price stepped into the hallway afterward, his face drawn. He found Dr. Lang waiting, her tablet in hand, her expression determined. "We need to talk about treatment options," she said quietly. They moved to a consultation room. Dr. Price sank into a chair. "I'm listening. What if we've been treating the symptoms instead of the cause?" Dr. Lang said carefully. "I spoke with a colleague last night. There's a condition called laryngomalacia, soft, immature structures in the larynx that can collapse during breathing, especially when the infant is lying flat." Dr. Price looked up sharply. "You consulted outside this hospital?" "I needed a second opinion on the breathing pattern." "It fits, Dr. Price. The position-dependent distress, the worsening after feeds, when reflux compounds the issue, the clear x-rays because it's not actually the lungs." "Laryngomalacia presents with stridor," Dr. Price interrupted. "Noisy breathing. Lucas doesn't have that. Not all cases present classically. And we haven't done a direct laryngoscopy to rule it out." Dr. Price stood, his professional composure cracking slightly. "So, you want me to order an invasive procedure based on a phone call to a friend? That's not how medicine works, Dr. Lang. We follow evidence, not hunches. The evidence is that standard treatment isn't working and that baby almost died this morning." The two doctors stared at each other. Dr. Lang saw the conflict in his eyes, the pride of a senior physician being questioned, the fear that she might be right, the weight of a case that had stumped his team. "I'll consider additional testing," Dr. Price finally said. "But right now, we need to focus on keeping him stable. I'm proposing heavy sedation to reduce his respiratory effort while we reassess." Dr. Lang felt her stomach drop. Heavy sedation meant giving up on finding the real problem. It meant keeping Lucas unconscious while hoping his body somehow fixed itself. "That's surrender. That's buying time," Dr. Price corrected. "Unless you have a better suggestion backed by diagnostic evidence." Dr. Lang had no response. She watched him leave, feeling the weight of hospital hierarchy crushing any chance of being heard. Meanwhile, Ruth had spent most of the night reading through documents her former colleague had sent. Case after case from her years assisting rural midwives, babies with similar symptoms, babies treated simply by keeping them upright, babies who had thrived once someone recognized what the machines couldn't measure. She arrived at the hospital for her shift carrying knowledge that could save Lucas's life, but she was a sanitation supervisor. Her uniform marked her as someone who cleaned floors, not someone who diagnosed medical conditions. Even if she tried to speak up, who would listen? Ruth found Imani in their usual spot. The girl had dark circles under her eyes. Her notebook lay open on her lap, filled with observations written in neat handwriting. "You should be in school," Ruth said gently, sitting beside her granddaughter. "I can't focus there," Imani replied. "Not when I know what's wrong and nobody's listening." Ruth pulled out her phone, showing Imani the scanned documents. "I found the old cases. You were right. It's called laryngomalacia. Babies born with soft airways that collapse when they lie flat. The medical term is fancy, but the solution is simple. Keep them upright." Imani studied the documents, her young face serious. "Why aren't the doctors checking for this?" "Because it's old medicine. Country medicine. The kind that came from watching instead of testing." Ruth sighed deeply. "And because admitting they missed something this basic would mean admitting they were wrong." Inside Lucas's room, Claire had overheard fragments of the doctor's conversations. She'd heard Dr. Price mention heavy sedation. She'd heard him admit they were guessing now. The realization hit her. These brilliant, expensive doctors had no idea what was wrong with her son. She stepped into the hallway, needing air, needing space to think. That's when she noticed Ruth and Imani huddled together, looking at something on a phone. Claire found herself drawn to them. "Excuse me," Claire said softly. Both looked up, surprised. "I don't mean to intrude, but you've been here watching my son. Have you? Do you see something the doctors don't?" Ruth and Imani exchanged glances. This was the moment when staying silent meant complicity. "Mrs. Hargreave," Ruth began carefully, "I used to assist midwives in rural areas. I've seen babies with breathing problems like your son's." "What kind of problems?" Ruth hesitated, then made her decision. "Problems that happen when a baby's airway is too soft. When they lie flat, gravity makes it collapse. They can't get enough air. But when you hold them upright, the airway stays open." Claire's breath caught. "That's exactly what I've been noticing. He breathes better when we hold him." "The doctors won't listen to us," Imani said quietly. "We try to tell them." At that moment, Elliot emerged from Lucas's room. He'd heard voices. His eyes swept over the scene. Claire talking with the hospital cleaning staff and a child. His expression hardened. "Claire, what are you doing?" "They've noticed something about Lucas," Claire said quickly. "Something about his position affecting his breathing." Elliot's face flushed with anger and fear. "You're discussing our son's medical care with the cleaning staff? With a child?" He looked at Ruth and Imani. "You need to leave this area. Now." "Mr. Hargreave," Ruth said calmly, "I understand you're scared. But your son, my son is being treated by 18 of the very best doctors money can buy. I don't need medical advice from people who mop floors." The words came out harsh, desperate. Elliot knew he was being cruel, but terror made people say terrible things. Security appeared at the end of the hallway, quickly summoned by Elliot's raised voice. Ruth gathered her cleaning supplies without another word. Imani clutched her notebook, tears pricking her eyes not from embarrassment, but from frustration. She tried to help, and it hadn't mattered. "Wait," Claire said, stepping between her husband and Ruth. "Elliot, listen to yourself. Our baby almost died this morning, and the doctors admitted they're guessing. What if we listen to someone who cleans bathrooms over trained physicians?" Elliot's voice cracked. "Claire, I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But we can't fall apart and start trusting random people with theories." Ruth nodded to Imani, and they moved toward the elevator. As they walked away, Ruth whispered, "Sometimes pride costs more than money can buy." Back in Lucas's room, preparations had begun for the heavy sedation Dr. Price had recommended. Medications were being prepared, consent forms brought for signatures. Claire stood by Lucas's bassinet, watching her son's labored breathing, feeling powerless. Then the feeding schedule arrived. Every 4 hours, like clockwork. A nurse approached with a prepared bottle. "Maybe we should skip this feeding," Claire suggested. "He always gets worse after eating." "The baby needs nutrition, Mrs. Hargreave," the nurse said gently. "And Dr. Price wants to observe one more cycle before we begin sedation." Claire wanted to scream. One more cycle meant one more crash. One more moment of watching her newborn turn blue. But what choice did she have? She was the mother, not the medical expert. She lifted Lucas carefully, cradling him against her chest. He latched onto the bottle, drinking peacefully for the first several minutes. Claire found herself praying to God, to fate, to anyone who might be listening, that this time would be different. It wasn't. Lucas began choking halfway through the feeding. Claire felt his little body convulse against her. The wet, desperate sounds of his breathing filled the room. Nurses rushed in, gently taking him from Claire's arms. They laid him flat in his bassinet to clear his airway and administer oxygen. And then everything went wrong. Lucas's oxygen saturation dropped faster than it ever had before. 70%, 60, 50. His heart rate became erratic, the monitor screaming with alerts. The medical team worked with practiced urgency, but nothing was bringing his levels back up. His tiny body seemed to be giving up the fight. Dr. Price burst into the room, issuing rapid orders. More oxygen. Different medications. Prepare for possible intubation. The atmosphere shifted from urgent to desperate. Claire backed against the wall, her world narrowing to the sight of doctors and nurses surrounding her baby, their movements efficient, but their voices betraying mounting panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were at the best hospital with the best doctors. Money was supposed to fix anything. Elliot stood beside her, his phone forgotten in his hand, his face ashen. All his power, all his wealth, all his connections, none of it mattered in this moment. His 4-day-old son was dying, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. In the hallway, Imani and Ruth had just reached the elevator when they heard the code being called over the hospital speaker system. Lucas's room number. Imani's heart seized in her chest. "We have to go back," she said urgently. "Baby, they told us to leave." "He's dying, Grandma. He's dying because nobody will listen." Imani turned and ran back toward the pediatric unit, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Ruth followed, her cleaning cart abandoned. They reached the hallway outside Lucas's room just as Dr. Price was ordering the team to prepare for permanent sedation. Through the observation window, they could see Lucas's color draining away, see the monitors showing numbers that meant life slipping away. Imani didn't think. She ran straight to Claire, who stood just outside the room's entrance, frozen in horror. "Please," Imani gasped out, her voice shaking with desperation and tears. "Please don't let them lay him down. He can't breathe like that. Please." Claire looked down at this child, this 12-year-old girl with tears streaming down her face, and saw something that cut through all her fear and confusion. She saw certainty, not the arrogant certainty of doctors protecting their reputations, but the simple certainty of someone who had watched and noticed and understood. Inside Lucas's room, Dr. Price was calling out final instructions. "Prepare for intubation. We need to secure his airway now." Claire made a decision that went against every instinct to defer to medical authority. She pushed past the security guard who had moved to stop Imani and Ruth. She entered her son's room, with them following close behind. "Wait," Claire said, her voice cutting through the organized chaos. "Just wait." Dr. Price turned, his expression a mixture of shock and anger. "Mrs. Hargreave, you cannot bring unauthorized people into—" "She's a child," Elliot interrupted, having followed them in. His face was flushed with rage and terror. "You're going to listen to a child instead of trained doctors?" Claire looked at her husband, then at her dying son, then at Imani's tear-streaked face. In that moment, she understood something fundamental. Expertise wasn't the same as wisdom, and credentials didn't guarantee truth. "Yes," Claire said simply. "I am." She turned to Imani, who stood trembling but determined beside her grandmother. "Tell me what to do." Imani's voice shook, but her words were clear. "He breathes when he's up, when they hold him upright. Every time they lay him flat, he stops breathing right. Please, just try keeping him upright." Dr. Price stepped forward. "This is completely inappropriate. Mrs. Hargreave, your son needs immediate medical intervention, not folk remedies from someone who's been right about the pattern this entire time." Claire shot back. "From someone who noticed what 18 doctors missed." She looked at Ruth. "You said you've seen this before. Tell me exactly what to do." Ruth moved to Lucas's bassinet. The baby was barely conscious, his breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Time was measured in seconds now. "We need to position him upright," Ruth said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "His head needs to be elevated, his airway straight. Gravity has to work with him, not against him." "This is insane," Dr. Price protested. "You're risking this child's life based on—" "Based on what?" Dr. Lang's voice came from the doorway. She'd heard the commotion and come running. "Based on the same observations I tried to tell you about this morning, the position-dependent pattern you dismissed." Dr. Price stared at her, betrayal evident in his eyes. Dr. Lang moved into the room. "Laryngomalacia. That's what they're describing. I told you we should test for it." "We don't have time for tests," Claire said desperately. Lucas's monitor showed his oxygen levels still dropping. 40%. 35. Ruth looked around the room quickly. There was no proper positioning device immediately available, no specialized bassinet designed for keeping infants upright. But she delivered babies in homes with far less equipment than this pristine hospital room offered. The sink, Ruth said suddenly. We need to use the medical sink. Everyone turned to look at the large stainless steel sink in the corner, the kind used for washing instruments for preparing supplies. It was clean, sterile, designed for medical use. And it was the perfect size and shape to support a newborn in an upright position. You won't put my baby in a sink. Elliot's voice was incredulous. I want to save his life, Ruth replied calmly. Right now, that sink might be the only thing that can. Dr. Price opened his mouth to protest, but Dr. Lang cut him off. We're out of options. And if this is laryngomalacia like I've been saying, this might actually work. The room fell into a suspended moment. Lucas's heart monitor began showing irregular rhythms. They were seconds from complete collapse. Claire made the decision. Do it. Ruth moved quickly, her decades of experience guiding her hands. She lined the clean sink with soft, sterile towels, creating a supportive nest. Then, with infinite gentleness, she and Dr. Lang together lifted Lucas from his bassinet. The baby was frighteningly limp. They positioned him carefully over the sink, his body supported at an angle that kept his head elevated and his airway straight. Imani moved to help, her small hands steady as she supported Lucas's head exactly the way her grandmother had taught her during their conversations about babies and breathing. The room fell silent. Even the machines seemed to pause in their incessant beeping. Every person present held their breath, watching this tiny baby suspended over a medical sink, held in place by a cleaning woman, an ER doctor, and a 12-year-old girl. At first, nothing changed. Lucas remained still, his color terrible, his breathing almost non-existent. Then, so subtle that at first no one was sure they'd actually seen it, his chest expanded slightly. Not the shallow, desperate gasps they'd witnessed before. A real breath. Then another. The oxygen monitor began to climb. 40%. 45. 50. It's working, Dr. Lang whispered, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief. Lucas's color began to shift from dusky blue toward pink. His breathing became more regular, no longer fighting against collapsed airways. The monitor showed his heart rate stabilizing. 60%. 65. 70. Claire's legs gave out. She sank into a nearby chair, her hands covering her face as sobs of relief racked her body. Elliot stood frozen, watching his son breathe normally for the first time in days, held by three people he'd dismissed and insulted just minutes ago. 75%. 80. Lucas opened his eyes. He looked around with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but he was alert, alive. His tiny hands moved, grasping at air. A small sound emerged from his throat. Not choking, not gasping, but the normal, healthy cry of a baby who was hungry and confused about why he was being held over a sink. 85%. 90. The medical team stood in stunned silence. Nurses who had been preparing intubation equipment now simply stared. The security guard who had been called to remove Imani and Ruth now couldn't look away from the impossible sight before them. Dr. Lang's face was wet with tears. It was laryngomalacia. All along, Dr. Price stood with his back against the wall, his professional composure completely shattered. His hands trembled as he stared at the baby he'd been seconds away from sedating, the baby who was now breathing easily in a position no medical protocol would ever recommend. 95%. Normal range. Ruth continued to support Lucas, her weathered hands steady, her expression peaceful. This wasn't magic. This wasn't a miracle. This was knowledge, the kind passed down through generations of women who had delivered babies and kept them alive with wisdom that predated fancy equipment and expensive tests. Imani stood beside her grandmother, still supporting Lucas's head, tears streaming down her face. She'd been right. She'd known all along, but knowing hadn't been enough. It had taken a mother's desperation and a grandmother's courage and the willingness of one doctor to question authority. Claire approached slowly, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Her son, breathing easily, his color healthy, his eyes bright. She reached out to touch his tiny hand, and Lucas gripped her finger with surprising strength. "He's okay," Claire whispered. "He's really okay." Elliot finally found his voice. It came out broken, humbled. "Ow, how did you know?" Ruth met his eyes without anger or judgment. "I watched him, Mr. Hargreave. That's all. I just watched and remembered what I'd learned decades ago from women who didn't have machines to tell them what was wrong. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one." Dr. Price finally moved from his position against the wall. He approached Imani slowly, his face a complex mixture of shame, relief, and something that might have been awe. "Who taught you to see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Imani looked up at him, this powerful doctor who had dismissed her, and said simply, "My grandma taught me to pay attention, to watch people, not just numbers on machines." Dr. Price nodded slowly. Then, in front of his entire medical team and the family he'd been treating, he did something that senior physicians almost never did. He admitted he was wrong. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at Ruth, at Imani, at Dr. Lang. "I was so focused on following protocol, on trusting established procedures, that I stopped actually seeing the patient. You saw what I missed, what we all missed." He turned to Claire and Elliot. "Your son appears to have laryngomalacia, a condition where the laryngeal structures are too soft and collapse under the weight of gravity. It's not dangerous in the long term, and most children outgrow it by 18 months. But it requires management, keeping him upright, especially during and after feeding." "Will he be okay?" Claire asked. "He should be," Dr. Lang answered, stepping forward. "Now that we know what we're treating, we can manage it properly. Special positioning, careful feeding techniques, monitoring as he grows. He'll need follow-up care, but the prognosis is excellent." Lucas continued to breathe easily, held over the sink in an arrangement that would never make it into medical textbooks, but it saved his life nonetheless. Nurses began preparing proper positioning equipment, discussing transfer options, implementing a care plan for a condition they'd all learned about in medical school, but never thought to test for. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The desperate urgency had given way to careful relief. Medical staff moved with purpose but without panic. Lucas's monitors showed steady, healthy vital signs. Security personnel who had been called to remove Imani and Ruth now stood awkwardly by the door, uncertain whether to leave or stay. Hospital administrators would hear about this incident, about the cleaning staff and a child providing the solution that 18 doctors had missed. There would be meetings, reviews, difficult conversations about protocol and hierarchy, and listening to unconventional sources. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. A baby who had been dying minutes ago was now breathing easily, held upright by 3 people who had refused to stay silent, even when authority told them their observations didn't matter. Elliot approached Ruth and Imani. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by raw humility. He knelt down, so he was at Imani's eye level. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving my son. I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for not listening." Imani nodded, suddenly shy now that the crisis had passed. "I just noticed things. My grandma did the rest." "You both did more than the rest," Elliot corrected. "You saw what needed to be seen. You had the courage to speak up when nobody wanted to listen." He looked at Ruth. "I said terrible things to you. I judged you based on your job, not your knowledge. That was wrong. I am deeply sorry." Ruth's expression softened. "You were scared for your child. People say things when they're scared. What matters is you listen when it counted most." She paused, then added gently, "And what matters now is what happens next. Lucas needs specialized care, but more than that, he needs people willing to keep watching him the way your wife has been doing all along." Elliot nodded, glancing at Claire, who stood watching their son with protective intensity. "You've been saying all along that the feedings were the problem. I should have listened to you too." Claire gave him a sad smile. "We both should have trusted what we were seeing instead of assuming the doctors had to be right just because they were doctors." Ruth carefully adjusted her hold on Lucas, whose breathing remained steady and strong. "In my years assisting births, I learned something important. Medical knowledge is vital, don't misunderstand me. But medicine works best when it combines expertise with observation, when it values what the people closest to the patient are noticing. Mothers know their babies. They see things that don't show up on tests. That's why I try to tell Dr. Price. Dr. Lang interjected. The pattern was so clear, but we were so focused on ruling out serious conditions that we didn't consider something this straightforward. Dr. Price, who had been standing quietly absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened, finally spoke again. We'll need to document this thoroughly, not to cover ourselves, but to ensure we learn from it. And we need to begin proper treatment protocols immediately. Specialized positioning equipment, feeding modifications, family education, and follow-up care, Dr. Lang added. Lucas will need monitoring as he grows, but most children with laryngomalacia outgrow it completely as their airways mature and strengthen. He should be able to lead a completely normal life. Claire moved closer to the sink where her son lay peacefully. How long will he need to stay upright like this? Ideally, as much as possible, Ruth explained, especially during and for at least 30 minutes after feeding. When he's sleeping, elevated positioning helps. As he gets older and his airways develop, he'll naturally handle it better. But for now, gravity is working against him when he's flat. Imani, who had been quietly maintaining her supportive position, asked a question that showed her continued observation. Will the reflux medicine help too? Since the choking was worse after he ate? Dr. Lang looked at the young girl with genuine respect. Absolutely. Managing reflux will help prevent stomach contents from making the airway collapse worse. You really have been paying attention to everything. That's what you do when nobody's listening to you, Imani replied simply. You keep watching and taking notes, hoping eventually someone will. The statement hung in the air, a quiet indictment of how close they'd all come to tragedy simply because the right voices had been dismissed. Elliot felt the weight of those words more than anyone. He'd built his fortune by recognizing opportunities others missed, by seeing value where others saw nothing. Yet he nearly cost his son everything by refusing to see value in observations from people he'd judged unworthy of consideration. That changes now, Elliot said firmly. Not just for us, but he looked at Dr. Price. This hospital needs to change how it listens, how it values input from everyone involved in patient care. Dr. Price met his gaze. For a moment, the proud specialist looked uncertain, vulnerable. Then he squared his shoulders. You're right, and I'll be part of making that change happen. This can't happen again. Claire joined her husband, placing her hand on his shoulder. Together, they watched their son breathe peacefully, held in this unconventional but effective position. Their expensive private hospital room had failed to solve the problem. But a woman who mopped floors and her 12-year-old granddaughter had seen what everyone else had missed. Dr. Lang approached Imani, crouching down beside her. You know what you did today? You saved a life. That's more than most people accomplish in a lifetime, and you're 12 years old. I just watched him, Imani said softly. That's what my grandma taught me, to watch and pay attention. That's what good medicine is supposed to be, Dr. Lang replied. Observation before intervention. You reminded us all of something we'd forgotten. As the immediate crisis subsided and Lucas remained stable in his upright position, the hospital staff began transitioning him to appropriate equipment, specialized positioning devices that would keep him safely elevated while allowing proper monitoring and care. But for these precious moments, he remained held over the sink, breathing easily, alive because 3 people had refused to accept that knowing something wasn't enough if you weren't willing to fight to be heard. Outside the window, dawn had given way to full morning. Sunlight streamed into the room, illuminating the extraordinary scene. A newborn baby breathing peacefully in a sink, surrounded by humbled doctors and a mother crying tears of relief, saved by observations from a child who had simply learned to watch. The dramatic moment when Lucas began breathing easily in the upright position over the sink had saved his life, but it also created an immediate problem for St. Augustine's private medical center. Within the hour, specialized positioning equipment arrived, custom bassinets designed to keep infants elevated at precise angles. Lucas was carefully transferred from his makeshift solution to proper medical equipment, his vital signs remaining stable throughout. But stability wasn't celebration. The medical team moved with cautious efficiency, aware that they'd just witnessed something requiring explanation, documentation, and investigation. Lucas was breathing well, his color healthy, his oxygen saturation holding steady without artificial support. Yet the relief was tempered by unspoken tension. Dr. Price stood at the nurse's station, watching through the observation window as his team settled Lucas into his new positioning system. His hands weren't quite steady as he pulled up the baby's electronic chart. Every notation, every test result, every treatment decision was documented, a complete record of how 18 specialists had missed something a 12-year-old girl had noticed from hallway. Dr. Lang approached quietly, her own tablet in hand. I've started the comparative analysis. Oxygen levels upright versus supine. The difference is undeniable. I know, Dr. Price said quietly. He kept his eyes fixed on the baby through the glass. I should have listened when you first mentioned it. We both should have pushed harder, Dr. Lang replied. But we got caught up in following protocol instead of following the patient. Inside Lucas's room, Claire sat in a rocking chair, watching her son with an intensity born of nearly losing him. Elliot stood by the window, his phone silent for once. Neither had spoken much since the crisis ended. What was there to say? Their money, their connections, their access to the best medical care, none of it had mattered. A cleaning woman and her granddaughter had saved their son's life. A soft knock interrupted their silence. A hospital administrator entered, a woman in her 50s wearing professional attire and an expression of controlled concern. Mr. and Mrs. Hargreave, I'm Jennifer Morrison, the hospital's director of patient relations. I wanted to check on Lucas and discuss what happened. What happened, Elliot said slowly, is that 18 doctors on your staff nearly killed my son by missing an obvious diagnosis. What happened is that the people who saved him were ordered out by security. Morrison's composure flickered. I understand you're upset. Upset. Claire's voice was quiet but sharp. Our baby was dying. The medical team admitted they were guessing. And when someone who actually knew what was wrong tried to help, your staff threw them out. Mrs. Hargreave, I assure you we take patient care seriously. We're conducting a full review of Lucas's treatment. A private review? Elliot interrupted. The kind where you figure out how to cover this up. Morrison's expression tightened. The kind where we determine what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. But I need to be frank with you about something. If this incident becomes public, there could be significant liability implications for everyone involved. Liability for who? Claire asked. For the doctors who missed the diagnosis? Or for the people who actually saved our son? For the hospital, Morrison said carefully. Lucas was treated by unauthorized individuals without proper medical credentials. While the outcome was positive, the liability concerns are substantial. Elliot stood up slowly, his business instincts suddenly sharp and focused. Are you suggesting we should stay quiet about this? That we shouldn't acknowledge what Ruth and Imani did? I'm suggesting that there are complex legal and medical considerations that need to be addressed before any public statements are made. Get out, Elliot said flatly. Morrison blinked. Mr. Hargreave, get out of this room. My son nearly died because your hospital prioritizes protocol over patients. Now you want to protect your reputation instead of acknowledging the truth? Get out. Morrison left quickly, her professional composure intact, but her mission clearly failed. After the door closed, Claire spoke softly. They're going to try to bury this. Make it go away. They can try, Elliot replied. But they're going to fail. Down the hall, Dr. Price had gathered his core team in a conference room. 5 doctors who had been directly involved in Lucas's care sat around the table, reviewing data, trying to understand how they'd all missed something so fundamental. Laryngomalacia typically presents with stridor, one pediatric specialist said for the 3rd time. Noisy breathing. Lucas didn't have that. Not all presentations are textbook, Dr. Lang countered. And we never did a direct laryngoscopy to check the airway structures. Because the x-rays were clear, another doctor added. No abnormalities. X-rays don't show soft tissue collapse during breathing, Dr. Lang said. That's the point. We were looking for structural problems that show up on imaging, not functional problems that only appear during normal breathing patterns. Dr. Price had been silent throughout the discussion. Now he spoke quietly. We missed it because we trusted our tests more than our observations. The pattern was obvious: worsening after feeds, improvement when upright. But we dismissed it as coincidence because it didn't fit our diagnostic framework. "So what do we do now?" asked a young resident who had been observing. "We document everything," Dr. Price said. "We acknowledge the error. We learn from it. And we make damn sure it doesn't happen again." "The hospital wants this handled quietly," someone mentioned. Morrison already spoke to the family. "The hospital can want whatever it chooses," Dr. Price replied. "But I'm not falsifying reports or minimizing what happened. This was a diagnostic failure. My diagnostic failure, primarily, that needs to be acknowledged." Across the hospital, Ruth had returned to work. She pushed her cleaning cart down familiar corridors, nodding to nurses she'd known for years, stopping to sanitize surfaces. To anyone watching, she seemed like the same woman she'd always been: quiet, efficient, invisible. But word had spread. Healthcare workers talk, and what had happened in the pediatric unit was already becoming legend. The cleaning woman who diagnosed what 18 doctors missed. The child who saved a baby's life. A nurse Ruth had worked with for a decade stopped her in the hallway. "Is it true? About the Hargreave baby?" Ruth continued, wiping down a handrail. "He's breathing better now. That's what matters. But you knew what was wrong. You told them. I've seen similar cases before. Long time ago." The nurse looked at her with new eyes, seeing past the uniform to the decades of experience underneath. "How many cases like this have you seen? How many times did you know something the doctors didn't?" Ruth paused in her cleaning, considering the question carefully. "Enough times. But knowing something and having people listen are different things." Meanwhile, Imani had been sent home with strict instructions to rest and return to school. She sat at their small kitchen table, her notebook open, but she couldn't focus. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from classmates who had heard rumors. A 12-year-old who saved a baby. Her grandmother came home from her shift to find Imani staring at her notebook, the same page still unsolved. "Can't focus?" Ruth asked gently. "Everyone's talking about it, saying I'm some kind of hero. But I just watched them, Grandma. I just paid attention like you taught me." Ruth sat down across from her. "That's exactly right. You watched. You noticed. You had the courage to say something. That's not nothing, baby." But they didn't listen until it was almost too late. No, they didn't. And that's the part of this story that matters most. Ruth reached across the table, taking Imani's hand. "You did something remarkable. Not because you're special or gifted, but because you were willing to see what was right in front of everyone. I was scared. Being scared and doing it anyway, that's what courage is." Back at the hospital, an external neonatal specialist had been called in. Dr. Patricia Chun had 30 years of experience and a reputation for both brilliance and bluntness. She examined Lucas thoroughly, reviewed all documentation, and performed a direct laryngoscopy that confirmed what everyone suspected. She emerged from the examination to find Dr. Price waiting. "Laryngomalacia," she confirmed. "Moderate severity. The epiglottis and arytenoid cartilages are softer than normal and collapse inward during inspiration, especially in supine position. Classic presentation." "We missed it," Dr. Price said. Dr. Chin studied him. "How was it diagnosed?" "By a 12-year-old girl who noticed the baby breathed better when held upright." Dr. Chin's eyebrows rose. "A family member?" "A hospital employee's granddaughter. She was waiting in the hallway and observed the pattern we missed." "And you listened to her?" "Eventually, after the baby nearly died." Dr. Price's voice was flat. "We were seconds from permanent sedation when the mother chose to trust the child's observations over our treatment." Dr. Chun was quiet for a long moment. "I've been practicing neonatal medicine for 3 decades. I've seen this scenario more times than I care to admit. Specialists so focused on complex diagnoses that they miss simple ones. Technology so advanced we forget to just watch the patient." She paused. "The difference is, most of those cases ended badly. This one didn't." 2 days after Lucas's dramatic rescue, hospital administrators made their decision. Ruth Carter was called into a meeting with Human Resources. The meeting room was small and impersonal, the kind of space where uncomfortable conversations happened. "Mrs. Carter," the HR director began. "We need to discuss the incident in the pediatric unit." Ruth sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap. "Your intervention with the Hargreave baby, while well-intentioned, created serious liability concerns. You provided medical advice without credentials or authorization. You allowed your granddaughter, a minor, to participate in patient care. I helped position a baby so he could breathe," Ruth said simply. "Same as I did hundreds of times before. That was different. You were working under a midwife's supervision. Here, you exceeded your role as sanitation staff. Would you have preferred I let that baby die?" The HR director's expression tightened. "Of course not. But there are protocols." The protocols were killing him. A heavy silence filled the room. Ruth's supervisor spoke carefully. "No one is saying you did the wrong thing medically. But from a hospital policy standpoint, this creates complications. So what happens now?" Ruth asked. "You fire me for saving a child? We're reassigning you," the HR director said, "away from patient care areas. You'll be working in administrative building maintenance. And we need you to sign this." She slid a document across the table. Ruth didn't touch it. "What is it?" "A statement acknowledging that you won't discuss the incident with media or make public claims about providing medical care. You want me to stay quiet. We want to handle this matter appropriately through proper channels." Ruth stood up slowly. "I've worked it here for 20 years. Cleaned your floors, emptied your bins, made this place shine. Never complained, never caused trouble. And now you want to hide me away and silence me because I had the audacity to save a baby you couldn't. I'm not signing anything. If you want to fire me for helping that child, you do what you need to do. But I won't pretend it didn't happen to protect this hospital's reputation." Ruth walked out of the meeting, leaving the unsigned document on the table. That afternoon, Claire Hargreave appeared at Ruth's apartment. Imani opened the door to find the impeccably dressed woman standing in their modest hallway, looking distinctly out of place. "Mrs. Carter? I am Claire Hargreave. Is your grandmother home?" Ruth appeared from the kitchen, surprise evident on her face. "Mrs. Hargreave, is Lucas all right?" "He's perfect. Breathing beautifully, eating well, everything the doctors hope for now that they know what they're treating." Claire's voice caught slightly. "I came to thank you properly, and to tell you something." They invited her in, offering tea that Claire accepted gracefully. Sitting in their small living room, the wealth gap between them was obvious, but Claire seemed unbothered by it. "The hospital tried to silence me too," Claire said. "They want to credit the medical team with Lucas's recovery. Call it a team effort without mentioning who actually figured out what was wrong." "That doesn't surprise me," Ruth replied. "I wanted you to know that we're not staying silent. Elliot and I have decided to speak publicly about what happened. We're going to make sure everyone knows that you and Imani saved our son's life." Ruth shook her head slowly. "Mrs. Hargreave, that's kind, but you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Claire's voice was firm. "Because if we don't, the hospital will erase what you did. They'll write a report that makes it sound like the doctors caught the diagnosis themselves. They'll make Imani disappear from the story entirely. And that's wrong. It might cause trouble for you," Ruth warned. "Hospitals don't like being embarrassed, especially ones where people like you donate money." Claire smiled slightly. "Let them be embarrassed. My son is alive because a woman with decades of experience was willing to speak up, and a child was brave enough to trust what she saw. That truth matters more than the hospital's reputation." Imani, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "The hospital told Grandma to stay quiet. They moved her to a different job." Claire's expression hardened. "They did what?" "It's fine," Ruth said quickly. "I've worked in worse places than their administrative building." "No," Claire said firmly. "It's not fine. None of this is fine." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Elliot. This ends today." While Claire made her call, a different conversation was happening at Imani's school. A local news reporter, following tips about the miracle baby story, had approached students asking about Imani Carter. By the time Imani returned to classes the next day, camera crews were waiting outside the school grounds. The principal called Ruth, concern evident in her voice. "Mrs. Carter, there are reporters asking to interview Imani. I've told them they need to leave school property, but they're persistent. I wanted you to be aware." Ruth picked Imani up early that day, navigating through a small crowd of journalists, all wanting to know about the 12-year-old who had diagnosed what 18 doctors missed. Imani kept her head down, clutching her backpack, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Is it true you saved a baby's life? How did you know what was wrong? What do you want to be when you grow up? Ruth shielded her granddaughter, guiding her quickly to their bus stop. But the story was already breaking. A nurse at St. Augustine's had leaked it anonymously, frustrated by the hospital's attempts to downplay what had happened. By evening, it was on local news websites. Hospital sources confirm. Child observed what medical team missed. 12-year-old's observations lead to baby's dramatic recovery. St. Augustine's under fire after near-fatal diagnostic error. The hospital's public relations team scrambled to control the narrative, but it was already too late. One of the nurses who had witnessed Lucas's rescue went on record, speaking to a reporter about what she'd seen. Her account was detailed, specific, and impossible to dismiss. A little girl named Imani had been watching the baby for days. She noticed he breathed differently depending on his position. When everyone else was preparing to sedate him permanently, she begged the mother to keep him upright. That's what saved his life, not the medical team, a child who paid attention. By the next morning, the story had gone national. News outlets picked it up, drawn by the compelling narrative. Wealthy family, prestigious hospital, 18 failed doctors, and a quiet 12-year-old girl who saw what everyone else missed. St. Augustine's released a careful statement. We are grateful for the positive outcome in baby Lucas Hogreaves' case. Our medical team worked in consultation with all available resources to ensure the best possible care. We are conducting an internal review of our diagnostic protocols. The statement mentioned no names, no acknowledgement of Ruth or Imani. Claire read it and felt fury rise in her chest. She called a press conference without consulting the hospital. She and Elliot stood in front of cameras and told the truth. Our son nearly died because doctors were too proud to listen, Elliot said bluntly. A woman named Ruth Carter, who works in hospital sanitation, recognized the condition from her years assisting rural births. Her 12-year-old granddaughter, Imani Carter, spent days observing our son and noticed the pattern that medical experts missed. They saved Lucas's life, and we want the world to know their names. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with discussions about medical hierarchy, the value of practical experience over credentials, and how children's observations are dismissed by adults. Ruth's phone rang constantly. Imani's school was besieged by media requests. Dr. Price, watching the press conference from his office, made a decision. He called his own press conference that afternoon. I'm the senior pediatric specialist who oversaw Lucas Hogreaves' care, he said, facing cameras with visible discomfort. I want to be clear about what happened. We missed the diagnosis, not because we lacked expertise, but because we stopped observing the patient. We trusted our tests more than the evidence in front of us. Ruth Carter and her granddaughter Imani saw what we missed because they watched without the bias of expecting complex answers. He paused, his voice heavy with emotion. This was my failure primarily. I dismissed concerns from my colleague Dr. Lang. I refused to consider diagnoses that didn't fit my expectations. And I nearly cost a baby his life because of professional pride. Mrs. Carter and Imani deserve full credit for saving Lucas. Any attempt to diminish their contribution would be dishonest. His honesty was unexpected and powerful. The story evolved from a simple tale of medical error to a broader conversation about how knowledge is valued, whose observations matter, and the danger of dismissing wisdom that doesn't come with formal credentials. Hospital administrators were furious with Dr. Price's public admission, but they couldn't refute his account without appearing even worse. Instead, they announced a comprehensive policy review and invited Ruth to participate as a consultant. Ruth declined politely but firmly. I don't need their committees or their apologies, she told Claire over the phone. What I need is for people to understand that wisdom comes from experience, not just degrees. And that children see things clearly because they haven't learned yet what they're supposed to ignore. But she did agree to speak at a medical conference that Dr. Lang helped organize. Standing in front of hundreds of healthcare professionals, Ruth shared stories from her decades of rural healthcare work. the patterns she'd learned, the observations that had saved lives, the knowledge that had been dismissed as outdated or unscientific. "I'm not saying traditional medicine is wrong," Ruth told the audience. "I'm saying it's incomplete when it stops valuing observation. When machines become more trusted than eyes. When credentials matter more than experience. Medicine works best when it combines science with the wisdom of watching, really watching, what's happening right in front of you." The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Several medical schools reached out afterward, asking if she'd be willing to speak to their students. Ruth agreed on one condition, that Imani could come with her and share her perspective too. Dr. Lang herself underwent a transformation. She'd been vindicated in her suspicions about laryngomalacia, but the experience had shown her how fragile professional courage could be in the face of hierarchy. She began speaking openly about the need for flatter organizational structures in medicine, about creating safe spaces for questioning senior physicians, about valuing input from every member of a healthcare team. Her advocacy made her unpopular with some colleagues, but it also earned her respect from younger physicians who had felt silenced by the same dynamics she was challenging. Within 6 months, she was promoted to lead a new department focused on diagnostic excellence and patient advocacy. The attention was difficult for Imani in many ways. Classmates who had ignored her before suddenly wanted to be her friend. Teachers who had never called on her now asked her questions constantly, putting her on the spot in ways that made her anxious. She felt exposed, visible in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. Some students resented the attention she received. "She thinks she's so smart," Imani overheard one girl saying in the cafeteria, "just because she got lucky one time." It hurt, but Ruth helped her understand. "People diminish what they don't understand," her grandmother explained. "They call it luck because admitting you actually saw something important means admitting they might have missed it themselves." One afternoon, a reporter managed to corner Imani after school, asking, "How does it feel to be a hero?" Imani looked at the camera, thought carefully about her words, and said quietly, "I'm not a hero. I just watched and paid attention. Grown-ups should do that more." The clip went viral within hours. Those few simple words captured something essential that resonated with millions of people. Children who felt unheard saw themselves in Imani. Parents recognized the truth in her simple observation. Medical professionals began uncomfortable conversations about how often they dismissed input from patients, families, and support staff. The statement was played on national news, shared across social media platforms, turned into memes and motivational posters. Imani's quiet wisdom became a rallying cry for better listening in all aspects of life. Not just medicine, but education, business, families. St. Augustine's finally acknowledged Ruth and Imani by name in a revised statement, praising their valuable observations and announcing a new protocol for incorporating insights from all hospital staff and family members into patient care. They also quietly rescinded Ruth's reassignment, offering her a position as a patient care liaison if she wanted it. Ruth declined that too. She liked her work. She didn't need a fancy title to validate what she knew. It wasn't enough for Claire, though. She established a foundation focused not on donating to medical research, but on training healthcare workers to listen to patients, to families, to anyone who spends time observing care. The Foundation's first initiative was creating educational programs about the value of diverse perspectives in medical settings. The Foundation's advisory board included Ruth, several nurses, patient advocates, medical ethicists, and Dr. Lang. They developed training modules that were adopted by hospitals across the country, fundamentally changing how medical teams approach patient observation and family input. It wasn't enough for Claire. She established a foundation focused not on donating to medical research, but on training healthcare workers to listen to patients, to families, to anyone who spends time observing care. The Foundation's advisory board included Ruth, several nurses, patient advocates, and medical ethicists. But more importantly, Claire ensured that Imani had choices. Not a handout, but access. A college fund for whatever path Imani chose. Mentorship opportunities in any field she wanted to pursue. The resources to build whatever future she dreamed of, free from financial constraints that limited so many bright children. "You don't owe us this," Ruth told Claire during one of their regular phone calls. "Yes, I do," Claire replied, "because Imani gave my son his future. The least I can do is help ensure she has every opportunity to build hers." Imani herself remained unchanged by the attention. She still did her homework in hospital hallways while waiting for her grandmother's shifts to end. She still took the bus to school. She still sat quietly in class, watching and noticing things others missed. But now, when she raised her hand, teachers listened. And when she spoke, people paid attention. Elliot Hargreaves' press conference where he publicly credited Ruth and Imani had been the turning point, but it was what happened afterward that truly changed everything. The story didn't just spread. It exploded across every form of media, becoming a cultural touchstone that sparked conversations far beyond one baby's medical crisis. Against his lawyer's advice, Elliot had stood in front of cameras and told the unvarnished truth. Not a carefully crafted statement, but the raw, honest story of how his privilege had nearly cost his son everything, and how two people he dismissed had saved Lucas's life. "I want to be very clear about something," Elliot had said during that press conference, his voice steady. Ruth Carter saw what 18 doctors missed because she had decades of experience that no one valued. Her granddaughter Imani, who is 12 years old, noticed patterns that trained medical professionals dismissed. And when they tried to help, I ordered security to remove them. I was so convinced that money and credentials were the only things that mattered that I almost lost my son. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "If you take anything from our story, let it be this. Wisdom doesn't always come with a medical degree. Sometimes it comes from experience, from observation, from someone who's been paying attention. Ruth Carter and Imani Carter saved my son's life. They deserve recognition, respect, and our eternal gratitude." The media response was immediate. Within hours, the story had been picked up by major news outlets across the country and internationally. Social media platforms erupted with discussions about medical hierarchy, class discrimination, and how society values different forms of knowledge. 12-year-old girl noticed what 18 doctors missed became one of the most shared headlines of the year. News programs ran segments analyzing the case, interviewing medical ethicists and healthcare workers about systemic issues in medicine. Ruth's phone didn't stop ringing for days. Reporters wanted interviews. Medical schools wanted her to speak. Hospitals wanted to feature her in training programs. The attention was relentless. But Ruth remained Ruth, grounded, practical, focused on what mattered. She agreed to some interviews, always making sure to credit the medical professionals who had ultimately listened. She spoke at medical schools, sharing stories from her decades of experience. But she declined lucrative speaking fees, accepting only enough to cover expenses. "I'm not doing this for money or fame," she told one persistent agent who wanted to represent her. "I'm doing it because maybe if enough people hear this story, the next Ruth Carter or Imani Carter who sees something important will actually be heard the first time, not after a baby nearly dies." Imani found the attention far more difficult. At 12 years old, she wasn't prepared for the intense scrutiny. News crews waited outside her school. Classmates treated her differently, some with admiration that felt false, others with resentment. One afternoon, a group of students confronted her in the cafeteria. "You think you're so special now," one girl said loudly. "You got lucky once, and now you're acting like you're smarter than actual doctors." Imani had stayed quiet, gathering her lunch tray to leave, but another student spoke up in her defense. "She saved a baby's life. What have you done?" The confrontation dissolved into typical middle school drama, but it highlighted how uncomfortable Imani was with her new status. She didn't want to be special or famous. She wanted to sit quietly and be left alone to think. Ruth recognized her granddaughter's struggle. One evening, after Imani had been particularly quiet during dinner, Ruth brought up the difficult conversation they'd been avoiding. "You want to know something true?" Ruth asked gently. "Most people who do important things don't set out to be heroes. They just do what needs doing. You didn't save Lucas because you wanted attention. You saved him because you saw something wrong and couldn't stay silent. That's the part that matters." But now everyone expects me to be this amazing person, Imani said quietly. What if I'm just normal? Then you'll be normal, and that's fine. Ruth reached across the table. You don't owe the world anything more than what you've already given. You were brave when it mattered. That doesn't mean you have to be brave every day for the rest of your life. Meanwhile, St. Augustine's private medical center was undergoing transformation. The hospital's initial attempts to downplay Ruth and Imani's contributions had backfired, resulting in widespread criticism. The board announced a comprehensive review of diagnostic protocols and a new initiative to incorporate perspectives from all staff members. Dr. Price had become an unexpected advocate for change. His public admission had cost him some relationships, but it had also earned him respect from colleagues who valued honesty. He worked closely with Dr. Lang to develop new training programs that emphasized observation skills. We teach medical students to trust tests and data, Dr. Price explained during a hospital training session. But we don't teach them to trust their eyes, to listen to families, to value input from people who spend time observing patients. That has to change. He shared Lucas Hagreaves' story at every opportunity, never minimizing his own failures. It was uncomfortable. It was humbling, but it was necessary. Dr. Lang's career had flourished in the aftermath. Her willingness to question authority had been vindicated, and she'd been promoted to head a new department focused on diagnostic excellence. She implemented protocols requiring medical teams to seek input from nurses, families, and non-medical staff who had regular patient contact. Every person who interacts with a patient has valuable observations, Dr. Lang told her team. Our job is to create systems where those observations are welcomed. Hospitals across the country began implementing similar changes. The Hagreaves Protocol, as some institutions called it, emphasized collaborative diagnosis. It wasn't perfect, but it represented a meaningful shift in how medicine approached patient care. For Claire and Elliot, the experience had fundamentally changed their relationship with wealth. Claire's foundation, officially named the Observation and Advocacy Foundation, quickly became one of the most innovative organizations in healthcare. Instead of funding research or building hospital wings, it focused on training healthcare workers to listen and value diverse perspectives. The foundation partnered with medical schools to develop new curriculum. It funded programs that brought experienced healthcare workers like Ruth into teaching roles. It created scholarships for students from underrepresented backgrounds. Elliot used his business connections to promote the foundation's work, speaking about the importance of intellectual humility. The man who had once dismissed Ruth and Imani now spent his time advocating for the practical wisdom they represented. 6 weeks after Lucas's dramatic rescue, Elliot arranged a private meeting, but it wasn't at the mansion where he and Claire usually lived. Instead, they met at a smaller property, comfortable but not ostentatious, where Elliot had invited Ruth, Imani, and Dr. Lang for dinner. It was an unusual gathering. The billionaire couple, the hospital cleaning woman and her granddaughter, and the doctor who had bridged two worlds sat around a dining table that felt extraordinary. Lucas was there too, now 2 months old, healthy and thriving. He lay in Claire's arms, breathing easily. His eyes tracked movement around the room with infant curiosity. I wanted to do this away from reporters and cameras, Elliot said as they settled in, because I wanted to say something without it becoming a public statement. He looked at Ruth and Imani, his expression genuine. You gave us our son's life, but you also gave us something else, a lesson in humility that I desperately needed. I spent my whole life believing that success meant being the smartest person in the room. You taught me that real wisdom is knowing when to listen. Ruth smiled gently. You learned it when it mattered most. That's what counts. I've been thinking, Claire interjected, about what happens next. The foundation work is important, but it's not enough. Elliot, and I want to ensure that what happened creates lasting change. She turned to Imani. We set up the college fund for you, but I want you to understand something. This isn't charity. This is us recognizing that your insight saved our son, and you should have every opportunity to develop whatever gifts you choose. Imani, who had been quiet throughout the meal, finally spoke. I don't know what I want to do yet. Everyone keeps asking if I want to be a doctor, but I don't know. You don't have to know, Dr. Lang said kindly. You're 12. You have time to figure out who you want to become. The gift isn't that you have to be anything specific. It's that you get to choose. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. Lucas's feeding schedule, Imani's school projects, Ruth's retirement plans. It was ordinary and peaceful, the kind of evening that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier when these people existed in completely separate worlds. As the evening wound down, Elliot walked them to the door. He knelt down to Imani's eye level, something he made a point to do whenever he spoke with her. Thank you, he said simply. Not just for Lucas, but for teaching me to see differently. Imani nodded, still uncomfortable with praise, but understanding the sincerity. After they left, Claire stood at the window watching their car pull away. Do you think we're doing enough? She asked quietly. I don't know if enough exists, Elliot replied. But we're doing what we can, and we're trying to listen more than we talk. 3 months had passed since the incident. Lucas Hogreave was now 5 months old, a healthy, happy baby who had completely outgrown the respiratory issues. His larynx had developed exactly as Dr. Chen predicted, and he no longer needed special positioning. He breathed easily lying flat, sitting up in any position. The dramatic crisis that had consumed everyone's attention had resolved into ordinary infant care, late-night feedings, diaper changes, daily routines. For Claire and Elliot, this ordinariness was precious beyond measure. Every easy breath their son took was a reminder of how close they'd come to losing him. Imani had returned to her regular life, though regular, now looked somewhat different. She still did her homework in hospital hallways, but now nurses stopped to chat with her, asking her opinion. Doctors acknowledged her presence. The invisible child had become visible. Her school had initially struggled with how to handle her fame, but eventually settled into treating her like any other student, which was exactly what Imani wanted. She joined the science club, not because of her experience with Lucas, but because she'd always been curious. She continued to sit quietly in class, observing and thinking, but now when she raised her hand, teachers truly listened. Some things had changed more dramatically. Ruth had finally accepted retirement from her hospital position, not because the hospital wanted her gone, but because opportunities had emerged. She worked as a consultant for Claire's foundation, helping develop training programs. She spoke at conferences, sharing stories from her decades of experience. I never imagined I'd spend my retirement teaching doctors, Ruth told Imani one evening as they prepared dinner together. But it feels right, you know? Like maybe all those years of being dismissed by people who didn't value my experience weren't wasted if they helped change how the next generation thinks about knowledge and where wisdom truly comes from. Do you think things will really change? Imani asked. Or will people forget about Lucas and just go back to the way things were? Ruth considered the question carefully. Some things will stick, some won't. That's how change works. It's never as complete as you hope, but it's never as temporary as you fear either. We planted seeds. Some of them will grow. She was right. Hospitals across the country had begun implementing new protocols, though implementation varied widely. Some institutions took the lessons seriously, restructuring their diagnostic processes to incorporate diverse perspectives. Others made superficial changes, more concerned with public relations than genuine reform. But the story had entered medical education in ways that would persist. Medical students studied the Hogreave case in ethics classes, discussing diagnostic humility and the importance of observation. Nursing programs use it to talk about speaking up when you notice something concerning. Even business schools used it as a case study in the limits of hierarchical decision-making. Dr. Price had undergone perhaps the most profound personal transformation. He remained at St. Augustine's, but had stepped back from his leadership role, choosing instead to focus on teaching younger physicians. He was harder on them than he'd once been, but in different ways, demanding not just medical knowledge, but intellectual humility, not just diagnostic skill, but listening ability. Tell me what the patient's family has observed, became his standard question during rounds. What have the nurses noticed? What patterns exist that our tests might not capture? His reputation had evolved. He was no longer known primarily as the brilliant diagnostician who was always right, but as the honest physician who admitted when he was wrong and worked to prevent others from making similar mistakes. Some colleagues respected this new version more than the old one. Others thought he'd grown soft. Dr. Price had learned not to care about the latter group's opinions. Dr. Lang's department had become a model that other hospitals studied and attempted to replicate. Her team had successfully diagnosed several complex cases that traditional approaches had missed, specifically because they'd actively sought input from unconventional sources. She kept a photo in her office, a candid shot someone had taken during Lucas's crisis, showing Imani supporting the baby's head with careful concentration while Ruth guided the positioning. Dr. Lang looked at it whenever she felt institutional pressure to prioritize efficiency over thoroughness. "This is why we do what we do," she'd tell her team, gesturing to the photo. Not for the easy cases, but for the moments when paying attention to the quiet voices makes the difference between life and death. For the Hagri family, life had found a new normal. They'd moved out of their ostentatious mansion into a more modest home. Not because they'd lost their wealth, but because they'd gained perspective on what mattered. Lucas's nursery wasn't in a separate wing attended by hired staff, but down the hall from his parents' bedroom, where Claire or Elliot could reach him within seconds. They spent less time at social events and more time at home. Elliot had restructured his business involvement to allow for more family time. Claire's foundation work consumed her energy, but it was fulfilling in ways her previous social obligations had never been. And they maintained their relationship with Ruth and Imani, not out of obligation or guilt, but because genuine friendship had developed between families who might never have met under ordinary circumstances. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after the original crisis, Claire brought Lucas to visit Ruth and Imani at their apartment. It was an unscheduled visit, the kind that happened between real friends. Lucas, now a chubby, healthy 6-month-old, sat on the floor playing with simple toys while the adults talked, and Imani did homework at the kitchen table. "He's completely healthy now," Claire said, watching her son with a mixture of joy and residual fear that marked parents who'd almost lost their children. "Dr. Chun says his larynx has developed normally. No restrictions, no special positioning needed anymore." "That's wonderful," Ruth said warmly. "Though I imagine you still check his breathing constantly." Claire laughed. "Every single night. Elliot too. We stand over his crib like paranoid first-time parents, even though the doctors have told us repeatedly that he's fine." "You'll probably do that until he's 18, Ruth observed with knowing kindness. "That's what happens when you almost lose something precious. You never quite stop being afraid of losing it again." Imani looked up from her homework, watching Lucas grab at a colorful block with determined concentration. "He doesn't remember any of it," she said thoughtfully. "Everything that happened, all the doctors, the crisis, the sink, he'll never remember any of it." "No, he won't," Claire agreed. "But we'll remember for him. And someday, when he's old enough, we'll tell him the story of how a 12-year-old girl and her grandmother saved his life." "What will you tell him?" Imani asked. Claire considered the question. "I'll tell him that sometimes the most important knowledge comes from the quietest voices. That watching carefully matters more than talking confidently. That his life was saved not by money or technology or prestigious credentials, but by 2 people who knew how to pay attention." She paused. "And I'll tell him that his parents almost failed him by being too proud to listen, but that we learned better." "That's a good story," Ruth said softly. "A true one." As the visit wound down and Claire prepared to leave with Lucas, she pulled an envelope from her bag and handed it to Imani. "What's this?" Imani asked. "Just a letter," Claire said. "For you to open when you're ready. No rush. Maybe when you're graduating high school, or starting college, or just some random Tuesday when you need to hear something. It's a thank you, but also a reminder of something I hope you never forget." After they left, Imani sat at the kitchen table, turning the envelope over in her hands. She was tempted to open it immediately, but decided to wait. Some things were worth saving. "What do you think it says?" she asked her grandmother. Ruth smiled. "Probably something about how you changed their lives. About how proud they are of you. About how grateful they'll always be." "But I just watched him," Imani said, echoing the words she'd spoken so many times. "I just paid attention." "Exactly," Ruth replied. "And that turned out to be everything." Later that evening, Ruth and Imani stood at their apartment window, looking out over the city. Somewhere in that sprawling landscape, Lucas Hargreave was sleeping peacefully in his crib, breathing easily, alive because two people had refused to stay silent when they saw something wrong. "Do you think we made a difference?" Imani asked quietly. "I mean, beyond just Lucas. Do you think anything really changed?" Ruth put her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. "I think you made more of a difference than you'll ever fully know. Not just for one baby, but for everyone who'll be listened to in the future, because your story made people think differently. That's how change happens, baby. One voice at a time, one person brave enough to speak up, one life saved that makes everyone question what they thought they knew." "I still don't feel brave," Imani admitted. "Good," Ruth said firmly. "The day you start feeling brave is the day you stop being careful. You were scared and you spoke anyway. That's the only kind of bravery that matters." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, grandmother and granddaughter, two people who had saved a life simply by watching and caring enough to say something when everyone else was too busy or too proud to notice. "Grandma," Imani said finally. "Yes, baby." "What really saved him? Was it me noticing, or you knowing what to do, or the doctors finally listening, or his mom choosing to trust us?" Ruth smiled. "Yes," she said simply. "All of that. Every single part. That's the thing about saving a life. It's never just one person or one moment. It's everyone choosing to do the right thing when it matters, even when it's hard, even when it scares them." She pulled Imani closer. "But if you want the real answer, what really saved Lucas was something simple that everyone had forgotten. People just needed to watch, to listen, and to remember that sometimes the most important truths are the ones staring everyone in the face, waiting for someone brave enough to point them out." Somewhere across the city, Lucas Hargreave slept peacefully. He'd never remember the crisis that nearly took his life, never know about the desperate moments in a hospital room when his fate hung in the balance. He'd grow up hearing the story as family legend. The time his life was saved by a 12-year-old girl who just happened to be paying attention. But the ripples of that moment would extend far beyond one baby, one family, one hospital. Medical students would study his case. Doctors would remember to listen more carefully. Children who felt unheard would remember that their observations mattered. And slowly, quietly, the healthcare system will become a little bit more humble, a little bit more willing to value wisdom wherever it came from. All because one child looked at a struggling baby and thought, "He can't breathe lying down." Sometimes the unthinkable isn't what saves a life. It's who we finally choose to listen to. If the people who saved your life didn't have the right credentials, would you have the courage to listen before it was too late? Hit that like button if this story made you think differently about wisdom, and subscribe for more stories that challenge what we think we know about the world around us.